And welcome to Hot Talk, a weekly programme we aim to give you the hottest news stories of the week. And in this week on our panel we have Michelle, and we have a special guest panellist, Professor of Culture Studies at UEL, Mica Nava, who is also author of publications such as Gender and Generation and Changing Cultures. So thank you so much for being here. So hot off the press and hot news topic of this week is in the wake of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plea for all Jews to migrate to Israel following the rise of anti-Semitic attacks. So the question I put to the panel is, do we feel he has legitimate reason to believe that the Jewish community are no longer safe here in Europe?
Well, I mean, the levels of... some people have claimed, and that there's been quite a hysterical response, that there has been an increase in anti-Semitism. Yes. Quite how anti-Semitism is defined is problematic, because some people have invoked the 1930s anti-Semitism, but there's no evidence at all that it's legitimised in the way that it was in the 1930s, where people were excluded from schools, kicked out of their homes, had their money taken away, and were not allowed to marry non-Jews, and so on and so on. So that was a very serious time, and of course it ended in the Holocaust. It didn't entirely end there. So whether the Community Security Trust, which actually measures anti-Semitic incidents, has said that there has been a decline in anti-Semitic events, and that they peaked at the time of the sort of invasion of Gaza last summer, the Israeli invasion. So it isn't, and then it's declined somewhat again. So, yes, there have been a trickle of anti-Semitic attacks in the decade since World War II. They are minimal compared with the numbers of anti-Islamic or anti-black attacks, deaths, minimal compared with the number of physical attacks on women, and so on. So I think to elevate them is very much of a political move.
The history reveals that the number of Jews is being always minor compared to people that is Muslim, people that is Christian. Until what extent would you see that? Is it actually that they are just trying to go back to the past where they said that Jews will be given back their promised land, or is it just for other purposes?
It's Jews and Muslims lived side by side and in harmony in the Middle East and in Iraq and Egypt and Morocco and so on for a long time without problems. I think the worst anti-Semitism was really in Europe and in Russia. So is that... I'm not quite sure what your question is about.
Sorry. Yeah, but what I wanted to ask you is whether this diaspora and this kind of going back to the old Solomonic Jerusalem, where Jews and other communities were together, is it actually what they're looking for? Because Israel, if we look at what was there before 1948. There was a Palestine country there where people were Muslim, where they were living calmly, and instead of this kind of a treaty that they were trying to do more as a we are going to dialogue with you whether you want us here or not. It wasn't that. It was more like we are going to be placed here and you can't do anything against it.
Okay, well, let's look at the context. I mean, as is well known, Britain was pretty anti-Semitic at the time. The government wasn't prepared to welcome large numbers of refugees from Hitler in the immediate post-war period, nor was America, despite their kind of enthusiastic, or maybe, as they are now compensating perhaps with their enthusiastic support of Israel, but nobody was particularly welcoming. So, there were people who were held in displaced people camps for up to 2 years in the 2 years following the war. So finally they went to Israel. Now, Israel seemed to be a solution to some of that anti-Semitism. And, I don't think it was because they wanted the promised land so much. Some people, maybe the most religious did, but an awful lot, a very large proportion of Israelis were not particularly religious. They were socialists, they wanted to work the land, they wanted a place where they could be secure.
I feel like now, within the press, the idea of Jews being opposed to Israel is very much on the hush. You have to really search for that information.
Okay.
There was mass, obviously, protests in New York last year, with Jews being anti-Israeli, which weren't really covered by the press. So why do you think that do you feel like there is an agenda there?
On the whole, the left is anti the Israeli policy in relation to Gaza and its expansionism, its ethnic cleansing, its failure to grant human rights, its illegal attacks on Palestine, and there are a lot of Jews who are included in that. It isn't that hard to find them.
Yeah, so one of the points you said earlier is in terms of the rise of anti-Semitic attacks, the media says, you said there's obviously a lot more attacks on Muslims and blacks, the wider minorities within this country. So again, we really wanted to question that. When that is the case, and I genuinely believe that is the case, why again do you think the media is so content on always demanding or pushing really much the forefront of this anti-Semitic thing is more important, this is really what's going on here, whereas we know there are a lot of other minority groups that are being attacked and being marginalised?
I'm not sure that all the media are focusing on the anti-Semitism of the attacks. I think there is a kind of qualified and a sort of fairly serious investigation of what's going on. And so I wouldn't really agree with you. I don't think there's a conspiracy among the media to represent these attacks. Because I think there are a lot of people who say, and a lot of Jewish people and senior Jewish people inside the Jewish community who are saying this is not anti-Semitic. It's stupid to invoke the terminology of the 1930s to describe what's going on. Okay, so it's true that some of these young people, and also the people who are expressing the anti-Semitism are now different kinds of people. And it's true that Jews have been targeted on 2 occasions recently in a very dramatic way. In both cases, it seems to be that the young people involved who did the murders were working on their own. They'd just come out of prison. They were, they had criminal records. They were orphans. They'd been brought up in care. They'd had very troubled kind of existences. And, I think it says as much about the way in which people of Muslim tradition or origin are treated in those particular kinds of countries. There's a much stronger sense, even though they've been quite welcoming to asylum seekers, those people have always remained outside the culture. I'm not saying it couldn't happen in Britain. Of course it could happen in Britain, and it has happened in Britain. But, I think it's... oh yes, one thing I wanted to go back to is the religious Jews, the extremely religious Jews, are also anti-Israel,
Yeah.
In Stamford Hill, there are always Jews on these kind of the marches who come down, these Haredi Jews with the beards and the locks and everything, who come on the marches criticising Israel because they don't think that Jews should be going to colonise Israel either.
Yes. Yeah.
So they're... and just to go back to the press is not uniform.
Yeah.
And I think there are there are some very critical voices in the press, and even on the right, it's not so clear, but certainly on the left. Historically, the right was most anti-Semitic, in the 30s and the 40s. Now the right defends Israel much more than it used to.
Yes.
But, there are critical voices.
Yeah.
And there's loads online, and there are loads of organisations like Independent Jewish Voices and Jews for Justice for Palestinians, and so on, that do circulate information about what's going on to a more critical readership or audience or group.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you. Make sure you tune in next week for more Hot Talk.